Sorry, I had a few technical issues, but if we're all ready, my name is Mason, as in the jar, and I'm a DEI communicator in uh, British Columbia, Canada. Uh, so, thank you for joining me today. Uh, DEI is everywhere these days, but I get asked what it means a lot. So if you're not familiar, it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Basically, everything conservatives like to describe as woke is in my wheelhouse. What that means is I communicate and inform about issues relating to that and also to prejudice and how uh, all of these things interact with corporations, organizations, society, and media. I spend most of my time writing on Medium about these things with something of a unique voice. And I'm also continually researching these topics when I'm not sucked into an argument online, as so many of us uh, do these days. Now, today we're talking about the many forms of Canadian suffrage and what Americans specifically can learn from how we Canadians manipulated and abused our democracy to better understand the modern threats to their democracy. After that, there will be a little time for you to ask questions related to DEI or even late 90s pop songs if you want. uh, I also want to take this moment to disclose that I am very asthmatic and I may cough at points throughout the session. I will be trying to mute myself so I'm not coughing loudly in your ears. But if I don't make it, I'm sorry, you've been warned. Please use your speakers if you can. And there we go. Anyway, uh, since we are discussing Canadian politics, I would feel a little remiss if I didn't explain the key differences between Canadian parliamentary system democracy and the American Republican system. So, first of all, one big key difference that we vote for the party, not the person. The political party will first gather all of its members and candidates and then hashes out its platform for the upcoming election cycle. They also choose a leader. Should they win a majority of seats, the leader they choose would become prime minister. The American way to think about how Canada does it is to imagine instead of voting for the president, you and your congressperson separately, uh, the presidential candidate would have been picked by all the Democrat or Republican candidates as their leader, and then that person would run for election as a congressperson in, for example, Des Moines, Iowa. So they would go back to Iowa and run for their congressional seat. And um, sorry. Okay, and run for their congressional seat. And if their party got a majority in the House, they would then become president. Canada, uh, sorry, just a moment. Sorry, there's a dog walking around. Uh, anyway, um, where was I here? Okay, so also Canada doesn't have the same veto system for laws being passed. Um, so, sorry. Uh, yeah, so Canada doesn't have the same veto system for laws being passed. So if a bad law makes it through our parliament, it becomes law. The reason for this is that Each political party tends to vote as a unified bloc because they are generally aligned on their platform. So any laws passed generally align with their platform, which is what the people voted for, and then it becomes law. With that out of the way, let's start getting into the dirt. Now, you may have heard Canada referred to as the Great White North, and assumed, as so many do, that the white referred to our idyllic wintry climate. You may hear Great White North and conjure images of snowy tundra with polar bears and dog sleds, Balto running across the Arctic to save lives. However, in Canada's early days as a country, the government's efforts to increase immigration from Europe actually never mentioned the wintry climates. One poster I was actually able to find offers free land grants in Manitoba. For context, if you've never been to Manitoba in the winter, in 1890, the average December low for parts of Manitoba was negative 18 degrees Celsius, or negative 0.4 in American freedom units, which is shockingly cold. Now, you may have heard about Canada's socialized healthcare system and assumed, as so many do, that Canada is a progressive socialist utopia free from discrimination. And that's actually not true either. The modern Canadian ideals of being welcoming and accepting of citizens and immigrants is a relatively new idea, and only just turned 63 years old as a concept for Canada. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and other sets laws that codified these popular ideas that you've heard of is only 41 years old. For context, pardon. So for context, Canada, the country, is 156 as of this year. Officially, the government has agreed that discrimination was okay for 60% of our history. Now, I'm sorry to tell you, but you've been lied to, and the liar was probably Canada about Canada. So since before its inception as a country, European settlers and colonizers established religious boarding schools known as residential schools. They did this in the American colonies too, though I believe it isn't as widely known in the US. The point of the residential schools, however, was to facilitate the kidnapping, abuse, and re-education of Indigenous youths to devalue their background and assimilate into white Christian culture. And to give you an idea of how extensive this part of history is, the first residential schools were built in the 1830s in Canada. Canada became a country in 1867. The last residential school closed for good in 1997. So Canada has a long history of abuse to minority communities that honestly rivals the United States in some ways. And our bigotry, just like in the US, was baked into our democracy. Sorry, Roy, I have seen your comment. I am going to respond to that in a bit, but thank you for contributing. Moving forward, so yeah, just like the US, we baked it into our democracy. Going back to our history, going back in our history to our time as a colony, the first election in Canada was in 1758, and it was open to all land-owning Protestant men. You might be tempted to think that anyone could be a Protestant regardless of race, and you would be correct in modern times. However, this was 73 years before residential abuse schools would have a chance to convert natives, and there was also a bunch of Catholics running around too. Not to mention that all of the women walking around, with minds of their own, and all of the many minority groups you will get around to. Please expect to hear about. And of all the many minority groups we will get around to talking about, please expect to hear about Indigenous groups a lot. So in 1792, things got a little bit better. Some provinces had been established, and in one at the time called Canada, which existed in parts of what is now Quebec and Ontario, I believe, had their first provincial election, and women were granted voting rights. All voting persons must have been 21 years old or older and own sufficient property. Given social norms at the time, though, many women still can't vote because it's still difficult for women to own property. This tactic has also been very common in the US too. In other ways, this is akin to requiring a literacy or citizenship test to vote. In theory, it can grant anybody the right to vote, but in practice, it keeps specific, targeted people out because those groups don't normally have as easy access to pass those requirements. In the case of Canadian women in 1792, they wouldn't have owned their own property unless they were widows or massively wealthy and unmarried. Most women in Canada were not either of those things, though. All right. Now, the one little tiny catch of that, though, is that white Canadians at the time didn't particularly like Black people. This is especially shocking to learn after you find that Canada has a long history, a long history being home to African Americans. For one, Canada was part of the Underground Railroad that helped escaped slaves to freedom. On top of that, about 100 years or so before the abolition of slavery in Canada, a group of Black settlers established a town in what is now Ontario called Priceville. But anti-Black sentiment was strong in Canada, and even after getting the right to vote, a lot of African Americans didn't because of harassment, bigotry, and violence at the polls, which wasn't an uncommon tactic in the USA as well. In fact, voter intimidation at the polls was reportedly used in the United States as recently as 2020. Which was mighty big news. In 1849, 57 years after gaining the right to vote in the province of Canada, legislation was patched that obvious oversight, and again revoked the right to vote from women. Canada specifically sought to disenfranchise women and wrote it into legislation, treating its previous enfranchisement as a little whoopsie doodle. This goes against her popular conception of the fight for equality, that when won, rights don't get revoked. But Canadian history again shows us that this is not the case. And American news demonstrates how easy it is to accomplish for motivated people acting in their own self-interest. Sorry, it is quite hot today. There we go. So human rights, like voting rights, are things that need to be enshrined in constitutions, well defined and hard to remove. Because when it comes to dealing with bigotry and systems that allow for bigotry, if something isn't specified in a law, someone will try to work around it. If they don't have to respect a right, institutions are specifically designed to ignore them. Now, let's move through history once again to 1857, 10 years before Canada united as a country. A law is passed that gives Indigenous Canadians the right to vote. It sounds like a great headline. However, they have to voluntarily assimilate into white Canadian culture and give up all of their treaty rights. And boy, howdy, can I tell you that it was a popular deal. Of the hundreds of thousands of Native people across Canada, one single person opted in. His name was Elias Hill. Now, the more that I think about this event, the more I'm reminded of the recent Supreme Court decision to do away with the imperfect affirmative action admissions policy for post-secondary schools. The system was by no means perfect, like the treaties in Canada. But dismantling these systems without resolving any issues that caused their necessity is like opening a crocodile cage and only telling BIPOC people that it's a kitty cat. Like that's just going to be disastrous, and like it's not going to help anybody. It's the same danger, just not fixed. Anyway. By the time the first post-Confederation election happened in 1867, voting was still limited to property-owning men who were 21 years or older. The next big change in Canadian voting rights we see happens in 1872, when Chinese Canadians are forbidden by law to vote. Previously, they could vote provincially. Keep in mind that Chinese men were specifically invited into Canada to work as laborers and build a cross-country railroad with the promise of a better life in a new country. After they got here and finished the job, a head tax was instituted on any further Chinese immigration as a means to prevent the men who came from bringing their wives and children to live with them. And to give you a clear idea of how insidious this particular immigration honeypot was, the construction of the aforementioned railroad finished in 1885. The head tax was passed into law in 1885. Construction had begun just in 1881. They were asked to immigrate to a new country for a job, leave their lives behind, a job where many of them had actually died to complete, mind you. And when they finished in British Columbia, where many of them remained after the fact, they had lost their right to vote and couldn't afford to send for their families because the head tax made the cost way too prohibitive for them. Today in the United States, many lawmakers, mainly Republicans, are calling on children to join the workforce in positions that they were previously barred from doing for safety concerns, and doing their darndest to change or revoke regulations designed to protect them while working. Without a single-payer healthcare system in place, when these children are invariably injured on the job, their families won't be able to afford to care for their injuries. It's weird how the history of governments promising opportunity to a vulnerable population and then changing the law specifically to disadvantage them and their families has this round kind of shape to it, right? Um, Not like that could be a theme or anything. Now, in 1876, Canada got a new piece of legislation that still exists today called the Indian Act. There's a bill in the USA with a similar name in it, and just before going into details about this, the thing to keep in mind is that the preferred terms, or like the politically correct terms to refer to natives, are natives or indigenous. However, Indian is commonly used to refer about to I can't talk today to speak about them uh, specifically in the context of this legislation, and usually in conversations about treaties and treaty rights, we hear terms like status Indian, which is a specific designation created by this legislation that applies to specific rights and government benefits. It doesn't usually come up, in my experience, outside of legislative or political context. The Native community has, largely accepted the term in that specific context, though opinion varies by individuals. Uh, it's still more of an administrative thing relating to a very specific and narrow legal context, and that's why I'm using it to refer specifically to these laws. Now, in Canada, the point of the act was originally to mandate forced assimilation of Indigenous people into white Christian Canadian culture. It has since been heavily amended to instead manage treaty arrangements and other government relationships with tribes. In the original 1867 version of the act, however, suffrage was again codified and granted to tribal members who voluntarily assimilated and gave up their treaty rights. Now, in 1885, the Electoral Franchise Act gets passed in Canada, and while a draft version of that bill did give suffrage to women, the final version that was passed just completely removed that. However, Canada decides to give it to some natives who meet specific property ownership rules. You might hear that and think that that sounds great. I need water. Okay. You might think that sounds great and easy to do on a native reserve for a native person. However, reserve land in Canada is known as Crown land, which is a parliamentary way of saying that the government owns it. And here we see that that insidious tactic again being used, where the government provides a system that benefits more people only in theory, but because of generations of systemic disenfranchisement, doesn't. So was it possible for status Indians to vote? In theory, yes. Were the majority of them able to? No. And theoretical equality is not the same as equality or even equity. As we move on to the Manitoba Schools Act, first I need to explain a little bit about the Métis. The Métis are a specific Indigenous group of Canada that came into existence during the French colonization of what is now Quebec. Frenchmen looking to explore and collect fur pelts, because that used to be a bigger deal, developed relationships with local Indigenous tribes to show them around and provide a guide. These guys were often female, and so they often had children together. And the mixed French and native children grew up speaking two, sometimes three languages, and with a blending of their parents' cultures in their home, as well as were often practicing Catholics. They became known as Métis. Eventually, the Métis people settled around the Red River in what is and Red River in what is now Manitoba, and the Manitoba territory wanted to join Canadian Confederation with some guarantees for the Catholic population, who were also frequently Métis. There were a few full-scale wars against the Métis because, again, white English Canadians didn't much like Catholics or natives, and Métis were both. After the dust settled, however, public schools in Manitoba, after the dust settled, however, Catholic public schools were treated the same as Protestant public schools in what is now Manitoba, and Manitoba joined Canada as a province. Then the Manitoba Schools Act came and threatened all of that. This act sought to remove government funding for religious public schools. In our modern world, we might think of that as a great idea. However, in these early days of Canada's history, the majority of Catholics were French or Métis. Catholicism was heavily associated with the French language, and in Canada, one of the provisions of Manitoba's entry into the country was that it would be able to determine the management of its own school system, and it had chosen to provide Protestant and Catholic public schools. And I am noticing the time now. Yeah, so as although Canada currently aims to conduct its elections fairly and equitably, even the incarcerated can vote in Canada, as an example. The past management of our electoral system seems to mirror current American policy and legislative changes regarding voting rights. While some tactics being used are uniquely American, like gerrymandering, a lot of other tricks are very, very old. So what needs to be done to protect American democracy and enshrine equity for all Americans? Take a page from Canada. We passed laws that specifically enshrine voting rights, that establish very, very clear and direct relationships between the provinces and the federal government, and lays out with no uncertain terms the powers each have in relation to each other. And those laws, if to work in America, have to have consequences for violators. They have to incentivize compliance, not just disincentivize non-compliance. The truth we need to spread about political activism is that if it's not written in a law, it isn't an obligation. And then motivated racists, homophobes, sexists, and bigots can undo that system, which we are seeing them try to do now. We need to demand legislative changes to human rights laws that protect everyone, and specifically name each category to be protected. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. I've been Mason, as in the jar. You can find me and support me through my link, linktr.ee/as in the jar. Please follow me on Medium at as in the jar. And please feel to share this presentation, which will be pinned on my profile after being published in An Injustice on Medium. An Injustice is a magazine that I regularly submit to. Now, if there's still time, I'll go through the comments, and if there's any questions, please do feel free to ask. So Roy, let's see what. Sorry, I'm just scrolling up through here. Hi from BC, Cheryl. So pardon me for saying so, but many Americans see Canada as a liberal, progressive, socialist hellhole. Yes, and as I think I kind of laid out here, that's very much not the case. We do have a huge problem with bigotry. Uh, yeah, it's not pretty. America did something very similar with Native Americans and has continued into this century. Some places, yeah, like it was a common thing done in Commonwealth countries. You see similar events in like Australia and New Zealand. They had their own residential school system as well. That the Maori, that indigenous tribes there were subjected to as well. This is a twisted version of history. Canadian women and the right to vote way before Americans. Leaving that. Okay, well, thank you, Jane. But like, uh, even though like suffrage was like eventually granted to all women and like all different minority groups. Like Canada did have a little like back and forth game of yo-yo with voting rights, and that's that. Like I'm sorry, it's just how history went down. Like I researched this. Like you can Google it if you want. Um, Even when specified by law, people still, yeah, like people will try to get around the law, but like that's why it's so important to like specifically codify uh, things like equity and voting rights, and like lay it out in no uncertain terms and ways that like have to be respected. Uh, like if like in Canada today, if somebody's voting rights get uh, like uh, they seem to be disenfranchised from voting, there is like an extensive court process where they go to like a human rights tribunal. Their cases laid out, and there's like consequences for uh, like disrespecting people's right to vote and trying to prevent people from voting. It's not cool. It's not good. Um, okay. Yeah, so like I have heard of the Underground Railroad and other things. So like Canada was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Like a lot of abolitionists came up here. A lot of free slaves came up here. A lot of them actually settled in. Uh, Thank you so much, Ray. Uh, a lot of people uh, uh, like came to settle here after escaping slavery. A lot of them came to a place called Africville in Halifax. It's a community in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and residents of Halifax, like white residents of Halifax, did not like the black people living there, so much so that they just did nothing about them. And like you might think like, oh, that doesn't sound so bad, like they're just leaving them alone. Like the city did nothing about the community, so they didn't invest in maintaining it. They didn't like consider it at all in a lot of like official city business. So by the time the 1950s came around, uh, Africville was the equivalent of a ghetto or a slum, and completely run down to the point where like majority white residents of Halifax decided like this is just a completely rundown part of town. We should probably like do something about it. And rather than like fix potholes and like renovate or whatever, what they decided to do was steamroll the houses and build a bridge. And the people who were living there were like the descendants of freed slaves, and like largely black population uh, who like were living in a slum. And when the city like forced them to evacuate, they drove up dump trucks, like garbage trucks, and got them to put all their like everything that they've ever owned and loved into a garbage truck and like drove it off for them. If they could prove that they owned their property, the city agreed to give them like a plot of land or like a new home or something. And a lot of people lost the deed to their home in the subsequent destruction of their home and were just left in the lurch. And like that is a thing that actually happened. Like inaction can be as bad as deliberate action. It's so horrifying. Very little is actually known about Africville in Canada. It's kind of Canada's Black Wall Street. The race riot in um, Tulsa, Oklahoma, that like killed a lot of black people and is not very well known about. But a thing that I like to tie to in American history that I think is a really good comparison to Africville is Seneca Village in New York City. Now in New York City, like Central Park is like very well known. It's super popular, very pretty, and it used to actually be this community of homes that like it was basically more street and more houses and more buildings along that path, and like a 7 block patch in what is now Central Park was Seneca Village, which was a predominantly black or like immigrant community that had been living there pretty much since uh, like the city was like New York City was founded. It was there since like the days of New Amsterdam, and then wealthy white people decided like, oh, it would be really nice to have like a green patch somewhere in New York City for like us wealthy people to like take a stroll through and walk our dogs or whatever. And so this mayor and New York City Council used the very dodgy concept of eminent domain to steal homes and uh, like steal land and take land, and yeah, it was very bad. Now, once again, I'd like to remind you that if you are interested in like more that I've written and will continue to write, Linktree, linktr.ee/as in the jar. You can also find me on Medium and in the pages of An Injustice, which exists on Medium. Is there any other questions or comments? I'll take a water break. Thank you so much for the claps. Are there any questions from anyone else? Comments? Oh, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, my mother in the chat supporting her son. Thank you very much. I love and appreciate you, Mom. You're wonderful. Oh. Okay. Once again, uh, please remember to follow me on Medium. Uh, like all of my links again, I'll put my link actually in here, www.linktr.ee/ as in the jar. All of my links, including like where I can be found on social media and where you can like subscribe to me and support me, and all sorts of other things can be found at that one link. It's very, very useful. Uh, and be sure to follow me on Medium. Um, Thank you so very, very much. Sorry for going a little bit long. It's been quite a day for me. And, like we're currently having a bit of a heat wave. That's why I look like my name is Frosty in the summer, or Olaf. Anyway, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully I'll see you next year and it'll go better. Thank you.